In this episode of the Foundational Series, we're going to talk about healthy fats and how we define what a healthy fat is. This is where we start getting into territory that is potentially controversial. And so I will provide some scientific backing for our rationale because what we're recommending is the opposite of what sort of the mainstream health world is, and to some extent even the alternative health world is recommending. Let's jump in here and we'll talk about kinds of fats. So there's three main categories of dietary fats. You have saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats. So at a gross level, you have saturation and unsaturation. And then within unsaturated fats, you have two kinds. You have the poly and the mono. So what defines whether a fat is saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated are the amount of double bonds in the carbon chain that these fats have. So in a monounsaturated fat, there's one double bond. In a polyunsaturated fats, there's more than one. There could be many different variations of that in polyunsaturated fats. So let's look at some foods that you may be eating and look at what the composition of the fats are, the fat profile. So this image here shows you what the fat profile is of, say, coconut oil compared to sunflower oil, compared to canola oil, compared to palm oil and butter. And what you can see here, the things to really look at are which ones have the highest amount of saturated fat and which ones have the highest amount of polyunsaturated fat. Now, in our cooking system and the way that we choose to eat, we focus on foods that are saturated, that have the most amount of saturated fat. And the reasons I'll get into later, but essentially it is because these fats are the most chemically stable. They're the most stable under heat. They're most stable when you digest them. They're the most stable when they get incorporated into your cell membranes, which is in large part the final destination for the fats that you eat, is to compose your cell membranes. So here you can see that coconut oil has the highest amount of saturated fat of pretty much any food that you would eat. And the food that has the highest amount of polyunsaturated fats is going to be safflower oil. And that is essentially showing you which fats are most stable under cooking conditions and under metabolic conditions. So we want to, I think a good place, we need to get, not enough of the conversation starts earlier in asking what is the function of polyunsaturated fats in the natural environment? Why do they exist if they're bad for us to eat? And there's a few nuances here, but I don't think the conversation really ever gets here. And so you have to understand where do polyunsaturated fats tend to grow? So what goes along with their ability of being fragile is their ability to be flexible. So what happens is in higher latitude climates, where they're exposed, plants are exposed to freezing temperatures, the plants will produce more polyunsaturated fats to compose their cell membranes to resist fracture during freezing temperatures, fracturing of the water that's in their cells. Because as you know, when water freezes, it expands. So as a protective mechanism, almost as an adaptive mechanism, the plants produce polyunsaturated fats to survive. And this is also why fatty fish have polyunsaturated fats in them, is for protection against cold and freezing. So we have, there, as you know, there's lean fish and lean fish tend to live in the tropical regions, and the fatty fish tend to live in the very cold regions. And so it's the same thing. Then conversely, in the lower latitude regions where it's hot year round, plants tend to produce more saturated fats that compose up their cell membranes. And the function of that is to prevent water loss in hot environments and dry environments. So especially environments that are hot and dry where they need to preserve water. Okay, so if you just kind of follow the food chain a little bit more and you go and you think about what happens in the temperate climates as fall comes around, these plants, they start to produce more of this polyunsaturated fat. And specifically the kind is the omega-6 kind, linoleic acid. That's the big culprit that we're trying to avoid at the peace offering. And so the plants are doing this, and then the animals that eat those plants consume that linoleic acid, that omega-6 PUFA, and the result for those animals is metabolic slowdown. Most of us learn as kids about hibernation in bears, but there is another sort of mild form of hibernation called torpor that many rodents experience. The squirrels and the chipmunks and all of them harvesting the nuts and the seeds of these plants and trees. And it's the polyunsaturated fat that's in them, the linoleic acid specifically, that causes metabolic slowing. And so what does that mean exactly? It means that their heart rate slows down, their digestive function slows down, their body temperature lowers, they are less active. In other words, they have less energy, they're less active, and they tend to sleep longer. So even if they don't go into full hibernation, they are going into a quasi-hibernation, and that is called torpor. This same effect is occurring in humans. And there is a lot of published evidence that high amounts of dietary linoleic acid, we'll just call it LA for short, high amounts of linoleic acid in your diet will induce insulin resistance, cardiovascular and chronic disease problems. And when we look at a map that overlays the obesity increase in the United States with another variable, sugar consumption, and another variable, linoleic acid consumption, you can see that obesity, insulin resistance, chronic disease all track almost perfectly with the rise of linoleic acid, not with the intake in sugar. And so our sugar intake is nominally increased compared to what it was in the early 1900s. It's not that much different. But the amount of linoleic acid that's in our diet now compared to that same time is drastically different. The issue is the high amount of linoleic acid. And if you look at your packaged foods, even your organic packaged foods, the things that have sugar also have a lot of sunflower oil, organic sunflower oil. They also have a lot of safflower oil or a lot of canola oil added to them. Just pick up your packaged organic food and flip it over a snack food or whatever, anything that's a convenience food, and look at the ingredients. And you will see how much polyunsaturated fat is in there. And this is exactly the problem that I'm talking about. And so what happens to these highly flexible linoleic acid molecules is that they are highly susceptible to what's called lipid peroxidation, which is essentially just breakdown. And when they break down, they create something called arachidonic acid. The short form of that is AA. This metabolite that occurs in the breakdown of linoleic acid is a direct input to something called the COX enzymes. And the COX enzymes are what are generating prostaglandins, and prostaglandins are inflammatory agents. This is what things like aspirin and ibuprofen are specifically meant to block. So they block the COX enzymes from producing these inflammatory agents. And so one of the ways that you can minimize these inflammatory agents is, instead of just taking those COX-1 and 2 enzyme inhibitors, is to eat less linoleic acid, because it is their metabolites that are directly feeding into these enzymes to make the inflammatory products. So the heat pressure, the oxygen, could be free iron in your body. All of these things can easily break down the structure of polyunsaturated fats, especially the linoleic acid that's in, quote, seed oils, because all of these things are seeds. That's where they're concentrated by the plant. And if they go into your body and they actually start to get incorporated into your cell membranes, now you have cell membranes that are easily oxidized with anything, really just any kind of spark can do it. Here's an overview of cooking oils and their percent of LA. And as you can see, safflower oil is at the very, very top. And at the very, very bottom are coconut, and tallow is very low, and also ghee or butter. And so you cannot avoid any LA intake. But if you focus on foods that have low amounts, you would essentially be mimicking what our ancestors had taken in, which was something like 1 to 2% of their total calories. So in other words, if you wanted to put that into grams, it's something like under 4 grams or under 5 grams daily, which is not very much. That means that you are eating no seed oils, that you are eating very little chicken fat. That means you are eating very little lard, and that the only fats that you're eating are essentially tallow, ghee, butter, and coconut oil, maybe cacao, because cacao is also very low in linoleic acid, but we don't really cook with that. And so it's like only these green items here on this chart that you would be consuming. That would essentially mimic what our ancestors were eating. And another point on this is that ancestrally, and this is pre-1865, the mechanical devices to press seed oils didn't exist. And the only time that you saw seed oils used, like flax or sesame in Eastern cultures, was really for medicinal or ceremonial use. It wasn't for culinary use. And so, it doesn't really matter what latitude, location, or culture humans came from. They were all consuming low amounts of LA until the onset of Crisco, which is cottonseed oil, in the late 1800s. As the campaign to demonize saturated fats ramped up, you saw the household use basically invert between the use of saturated fat, like animal-based fats, the ones that we talked about, and the use of seed oils. Another way to think about this is that when you are cooking, the heat applied to these cooking oils will create lipid peroxidation, inflammatory agents, as we talked about, the AA. And so some of these can withstand higher temperatures than others, but your rule of thumb should be the higher the heat, the lower the amount of both polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats. So in this case, you want to be focusing on something like using coconut or ghee butter for higher heat cooking instead of something like olive oil, which has a much higher percentage of monounsaturated fats. So if it has a lot of unsaturated fats, it's going to be less robust in cooking. So even though we like olive oil used in dressing, salad dressings, and that kind of thing, it is in its raw form, cold pressed, and not heated. Otherwise, high heat cooking, if you're going to go very high, the more saturated, the better. I think the last important part here is to talk about what animals have more or less of these polyunsaturated fats. And you can, very, very simply divide animals, at least animals that we eat, into two camps, either monogastric or ruminant animals. And so what that means is a ruminant animal is an animal that has a rumen, also very simplistically, the 4 stomachs, one of them being the rumen. And in the rumen are bacteria that biohydrogenate. What they do is they essentially convert polyunsaturated fats into saturated fats. Monogastric animals cannot do that. So what are examples of this? A bird or any kind of poultry and pigs are monogastric. So if they're being fed a commercial diet, which is predominantly seeds, they're going to have a high amount of linoleic acid in their fat tissue, just like humans. But if a ruminant animal is being fed a commercial diet, and that could be a cow or a deer or bison or goat or sheep, these are all examples of ruminant animals. They will convert that linoleic acid from the seeds into saturated fat. And this is one of the superpowers of ruminant animals, and why they should be consumed and why they should be incorporated into regenerative farming, and why they were historically used in that context. Now, it's not all birds and pigs that you would be concerned about. It's really just the commercially raised ones, the ones that are being fed predominantly seeds in their diet. These animals in the wild, or on a regenerative farm, the chicken and the pig is eating from the compost. So they're eating more protein. They're eating bugs in the ground, so they're getting more protein. And they have a different fat composition than a commercially fed animal. So say, for example, hunting pig or hunting for bird, those animals are going to have different fats. Those are more in line with an ancestral diet. So just keeping in mind, and that one of the areas, a big area that a lot of humans get high linoleic acid is coming from chicken fat. So you want to avoid chicken fat, and where you would find that mostly is in the thigh. Unless you're getting, your foraging feral chicken that's kind of running around the neighborhood. But just to recap everything here, we talked about the 3 types of fat. We talked about the function of polyunsaturated fats in the environment. We talked about how linoleic acid, specifically the one that's concentrated in seed oils, is directly linked to chronic disease, obesity in the United States. We talked about how the problem is not sugar. The problem is really the inability to utilize sugar, which is happening at the level of the mitochondria, and I'm going to make a separate video about that. We talked about the use of fats in cooking. So the same mechanism of lipid peroxidation that would happen in your body if those fats got incorporated into your cell membranes would happen in cooking. And that's why you want to focus on high saturated fat, low unsaturated fat cooking oils or cooking fats. That we talked about the difference between monogastrics and ruminant animals, and why traditional cultures were typically not using LA in their diet, and we're eating more saturated monounsaturated fats. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week when we start talking about eating enough food, calories, and the benefits of carbohydrates.